I never thought I'd be the guy telling a story like this. You hear about it happening to other people, some friend of a friend, some unlucky guy on the internet, but you never think it's going to be you. But here I am. I'm Jake, 29, and I've been a mechanic in Chicago since I was 23. Not exactly a billionaire CEO, but I make a decent living. I like my job. There's something about fixing cars, about bringing a dead engine back to life, that just makes sense to me. The world might be a mess, but under the hood, everything has a purpose. And for a long time, I thought my life had a purpose too. I had a fiancée, Lindsay. We were together for 4 years. We had plans, a future. Hell, we were even supposed to drive away from our wedding in my grandpa's 1967 Mustang, the car I'd been restoring ever since he passed away. That car was more than just metal and parts to me. It was a promise. My grandpa taught me everything I know about cars. I still remember being a little kid, barely tall enough to see over the hood, standing on a milk crate while he explained how an engine worked. He'd hand me a wrench, let me turn the bolts, even when my tiny hands could barely grip them. "Motor oil runs in our veins, kid," he used to say. And before he died, he made me promise one thing. Finish the Mustang. Lindsay used to love that car too. When we first got together, she'd hang around the garage, wearing an old pair of my overalls, handing me tools, laughing when she got grease on her nose. She'd sit in the passenger seat, running her hands over the dashboard, dreaming about the day we'd take our first drive in it as husband and wife. Or at least, that's who she used to be. Everything changed 3 months ago when she got a big promotion at work. At first, I was proud of her. She worked hard. She deserved it. But then the changes started. She began dressing differently. Fancy, expensive outfits, designer bags, makeup that probably cost more than my weekly paycheck. She spent more and more time at the office, late nights, emergency meetings, networking events. I tried to be understanding. Really, I did. But then she started acting different around me. The little things, turning her phone face down, stepping outside to take calls, canceling plans at the last minute. She stopped coming to the garage altogether. Said she didn't want to get her new clothes dirty. Then she started pulling away from my family too. She used to love my sister, Amy. They were like best friends. But when Amy needed help moving, Lindsay bailed. Said she had to prepare for a big presentation. I went alone. And that's when Amy's new neighbor, who just so happened to work at Lindsay's company, casually mentioned there weren't any big presentations that week. That was the first time my stomach really sank. But I still wanted to believe her. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was overthinking things, that I just needed to trust her. Then came the breaking point. It was a Saturday. I had a long shift at the garage, and Lindsay told me she was going shopping with her work friends. No big deal, right? But then I got a text from my cousin, Tim. It was a picture of Lindsay. She wasn't shopping. She was at a fancy restaurant across town, with her boss, Ethan, leaning in close, smiling, laughing. Tim's message was short, "Bro, you good?" I stared at the picture, my chest tight. I didn't even know what to say. So I lied. Yeah, must be a work lunch. But I knew. And for the first time, I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, when Lindsay got home, she barely even looked at me. Just walked in, dropped her purse on the counter, and kicked off her shoes like it was any other night. I was sitting on the couch, staring at my phone, the picture still pulled up. "Where were you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She paused for a fraction of a second, just a second too long, before turning to me with a casual smile. "Oh, just out with the girls. Shopping." "Why?" I exhaled slowly. My hands clenched into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. I held up my phone. Tim's picture was right there on the screen. Her smile vanished. For the first time in a long time, she actually looked nervous. I tilted my head. "Want to try that again?" Lindsay hesitated. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to come up with an excuse. Then she sighed dramatically and rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, Jake. It was just lunch." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "Just lunch? With your boss? At a fancy restaurant?" She crossed her arms, like I was the problem here. "Do I have to explain every meal I eat now?" I inhaled sharply, biting back the 1,000 things I wanted to say. Instead, I asked the one thing that really mattered. Are you cheating on me? Silence. It was only for a second, but it was long enough. Her eyes darted to the side, just for a fraction of a second. That was all I needed to see. When she finally spoke, her voice was too careful. Jake, you're being ridiculous. I clenched my jaw. That's not an answer. She sighed, sitting down across from me. That fake sympathetic look on her face made my skin crawl. I was going to talk to you about this, she said. But clearly you're too emotional right now. I narrowed my eyes. Talk to me about what? She took a deep breath, like she was about to drop some great revelation. Then she looked me dead in the eyes and said, I think we should try an open relationship. The words hit me like a gut punch. I just stared at her, trying to process what I just heard. What? Lindsay nodded, like she'd just come up with the smartest idea in the world. I've been thinking a lot about this. We've been together for so long, and I just feel like, before we settle down, we should explore other options. You know, see what's out there. I blinked. I actually felt dizzy for a second. So, you want to sleep with other people? Lindsay gave me this fake sympathetic smile. It's not just about that. It's about growth. Expanding our experiences. I exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the couch. My mind was spinning. Then something clicked. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Only for you, though. Right. Lindsay's smile widened. I knew you'd understand. She had no idea. I understood everything, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I sat back, running a hand over my face. I should have been furious. I should have yelled, thrown something, demanded the truth. But instead, I just laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so damn predictable. Lindsay frowned. What's so funny? I shook my head, still chuckling. Nah, it's just wow. You really thought I'd go for this, huh? Her expression shifted, just for a second, like she hadn't expected me to see through her so quickly. Jake, this isn't a bad thing, she tried, her voice soft. Lots of couples do this before they get married. It helps them grow. Grow? I repeated, tilting my head. So, what? While you're out exploring, I just sit at home and wait? Lindsay sighed dramatically, like I was a child who just didn't get it. That's not what I mean, she said. I need more. More experiences, more connections. You have to understand. My life is changing and… I held up a hand. Yeah, I get it. She brightened, like she actually thought I was agreeing. So I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Time for my own little surprise. You know what? I said casually. I've actually been thinking the same thing. Lindsay blinked. Wait, what? I nodded, rubbing my chin like I was really mulling it over. Yeah, been wondering how to bring it up. She stared at me, like her brain was short-circuiting. You want an open relationship? I shrugged. Why not? Hell, maybe I'll start with Jessica. Her entire face changed. Jessica was the new receptionist at her office. Red hair, sweet smile, always friendly when I stopped by. Lindsay sat up straight. Wait, Jessica? Yeah. I grinned, like I just had a great idea. She's always super nice to me. Last time I was at your office, she mentioned she's into classic cars. Maybe I'll take her for a ride in the Mustang. Lindsay's eyes went dark. That's not what I meant, she snapped. I raised an eyebrow. Why not? Isn't that what an open relationship means? We both get to see other people? Her jaw tightened. You can't date Jessica? I smirked. Oh, I get it. I snapped my fingers. You meant an open relationship, just for you. She flinched. That's not fair. I let out a breath. No, Lindsay. What's not fair is you thinking I'm stupid enough to fall for this. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in months, she had nothing to say. I pushed myself up from the couch, grabbing my keys. You know what? You go ahead. Explore, grow, do whatever the hell you want. She brightened, just for a second, until I added, just don't expect me to wait around. Her face fell. I turned toward the door. She grabbed my arm. Jake, please, she said, voice shaking now. Just think about this. I looked down at her hand on my sleeve. I used to love the way she touched me. Now, it meant nothing. I pulled free. I did think about it, I said. And I'm done. Then I walked out the door. And I didn't look back. I ended up at Ryan's place that night. He took one look at me and stepped aside. Damn, he muttered. Come in. His wife, Megan, didn't ask questions. She just hugged me and handed me a blanket. The next morning, she made me pancakes. The kind my mom used to make. You don't have to stay here forever, Ryan said as I pushed my food around my plate. But stay as long as you need, man. I nodded. Appreciate it. Then I called Frank, my boss. Told him the whole damn story. Frank sighed. Kid, that's rough. Yeah. I let out a slow breath. I was gonna come in today, but... Take the day off, he interrupted. Dave can handle your appointments. I hesitated. You sure? Frank's voice softened. You know what your grandpa would say right now? I closed my eyes. I could hear him. When life gets messy, kid, focus on what you can fix with your hands. I exhaled. Yeah, I know. But something in my gut told me this wasn't over. The next morning, I parked my truck across from our apartment building at 7 a.m. Lindsay's car was still there. Normally, she left for work by 7:30. I waited. At 7:25, she walked out. Perfect hair, designer bag, crisp blazer. But instead of heading downtown toward her office, she drove in the opposite direction. My grip on the wheel tightened. I followed her, keeping a few cars between us. My heart was pounding, but my mind was clear. 15 minutes later, she pulled into a fancy luxury apartment complex. And then, Ethan walked out to meet her. They didn't even try to hide it. He kissed her right there in the parking lot, his hands on her waist like they'd done this 1,000 times before. My stomach turned. I almost dropped my phone, but my hands moved on autopilot. Snap, snap, snap. They didn't go to the office. They got into his car and drove off to breakfast. While the guys at my lowly mechanic job were already 2 hours into their shifts, my fiancée was out sipping mimosas with her boss. I drove back to Ryan's place in a daze. Megan took one look at my face and set her coffee down. What happened? I handed her my phone. She scrolled through the pictures, her jaw tightening. Ryan cursed under his breath. Megan exhaled. Then, softly, she said the words I hadn't been able to say to myself yet. She's been cheating for a long time, Jake. I stared at the pictures again. I knew what I had to do next. I was going to her parents' house, and I was bringing proof. I pulled up outside Robert and Diane's house, my grip on the steering wheel tight. I'd been here 100 times before. Sunday dinners, birthdays, lazy afternoons sitting on their porch. But this time, I wasn't their future son-in-law. This time, I was just the guy their daughter cheated on. I exhaled sharply and grabbed my phone. The pictures of Lindsay and Ethan, her boss, her growth, her better option, were still pulled up on the screen. My stomach twisted. This wasn't about getting revenge. This was about telling the truth. I knocked, and Diane answered a few seconds later. The moment she saw my face, her smile faltered. Honey, she said softly, shouldn't you be at work? I swallowed hard. Can I come in? She stepped aside immediately. Of course. Is everything okay? I walked into the kitchen, the familiar scent of coffee and cinnamon filling the air. It felt wrong, like I'd stepped into a memory instead of reality. Robert came in from the garage, wiping his hands on a shop rack, just like I did at work. That resemblance used to feel comforting. Now, it just made me sick. Robert frowned. Jake? What's going on? I didn't say anything. I just set my phone down on the kitchen table and tapped the screen. The pictures filled the silence. Diane's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God. Robert? He didn't move. Didn't say a word. Just stood there, staring at the photos. Jaw clenched. Shoulders stiff. Finally, he spoke. How long? His voice was rough, like the words physically hurt coming out. I swallowed. I don't know, but my guess? Since the promotion. Diane let out a shaky breath. We raised her better than this. Robert shook his head. Then, suddenly, he turned and slammed his fist onto the table. Diane flinched. I didn't. Goddamn it. Lindsay, he growled. What the hell is wrong with her? I had no answer for that. Diane sniffled. wiping at her eyes. Jake, I don't even know what to say. I nodded, my throat tight. I'm calling off the wedding. Robert stopped pacing. Diane let out a soft, broken sound. I understand, she whispered. There was a long, heavy silence. Then Robert walked over, gripping my shoulder. His hand was firm, rough from years of hard work. When he spoke, his voice was low but steady. You're still welcome here, he said. Always. That was when my chest tightened. Not from pain, but from relief. I hadn't realized how badly I needed to hear that. I nodded, my voice thick. Thanks, Robert. He nodded back. Then, after a moment, he said something that made my blood run cold. Does she know you know? I blinked. No. Diane looked at me, her face pale. She's going to come up with an excuse, honey. She's going to try to twist this. I clenched my jaw. Yeah, I know. Robert crossed his arms. She's coming for dinner tonight. You should be here. My stomach turned. I don't. You deserve to say your piece, he cut in firmly. And she needs to face what she's done. I hesitated, then nodded. And just like that, the trap was set. That evening, I was sitting at their kitchen counter, peeling potatoes with Diane, when I heard Lindsay's car pull up. Diane squeezed my hand before she turned back to the stove. Robert was in the garage, probably trying to keep himself from losing his damn mind. The front door opened. Lindsay walked in like she owned the place. Still in her perfect work clothes, designer bag slung over her shoulder. She saw me sitting there and froze. What's he doing here? She asked, looking at her mom. Diane stirred the pot on the stove, not turning around. Sit down, Lindsay. Lindsay blinked. Mom. Robert walked in, wiping his hands on a rag. Sit down. Lindsay sat. Some habits, I guess, don't change. She folded her arms, clearly annoyed. What's going on? Robert didn't say a word. Instead, he picked up my phone from the table, tapped the screen, and slid it across to her. Lindsay glanced down. Then her entire face drained of color. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the images like she was trying to will them out of existence. That's not, she started, her voice cracking. It's not what it looks like. I laughed. I couldn't help it. Not what it looks like? I echoed. Because it looks like you're making out with your boss at 7:30 in the morning, when you're supposed to be at work. She opened her mouth. I cut her off. It looks like you've been lying to me for months. Lindsay's hands started shaking. Jake, I pulled out another set of screenshots. These charges from the Grand Hotel. That's not what I think either. What about the dinners for two at fancy restaurants? All those emergency meetings that just so happened to line up with my late shifts? Diane let out a quiet sob behind me. Robert was stone silent. Lindsay was unraveling. You don't understand? Then explain it to me. My voice was eerily calm. She looked at her mom for help. Diane just shook her head, eyes red. Robert finally spoke, his voice low and cold. How long, Lindsay? Lindsay's eyes filled with tears. Dad, How long? She swallowed hard. A few months. Robert exhaled sharply, looking away, like he physically couldn't stand to look at her. I leaned forward, my voice quiet but firm. You could have just told me. Lindsay blinked rapidly, tears spilling down her cheeks. Jake. I cut her off. You could have just told me you didn't love me anymore. Her breath hitched. I shook my head. But instead, you made me feel like I wasn't good enough. You made me question myself. Made me think I was crazy for noticing the change in you. And all along, it wasn't me. It was you. She reached for my hand. I pulled back. Her face crumpled. Robert cleared his throat. Jake, do you want to say anything else? I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. No. Lindsay looked devastated. But I didn't feel bad. Not anymore. Because I was done. I turned to Robert and Diane, my voice steady. I'll be by next week to pick up my stuff. Diane nodded, wiping her eyes. Robert shook my hand, gripping it tightly. And then, without another glance at Lindsay, I walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't go back to Ryan's that night. I didn't go anywhere, really. I just drove. Not in the Mustang, not yet. That wasn't how this needed to happen. I took my truck instead, let the city blur past me, let my thoughts untangle as the tires hummed against the pavement. At some point, I found myself outside the garage. I wasn't planning on going in, but my hands were already on the door handle before I could think twice. The smell of oil and metal wrapped around me like a second skin. The overhead lights buzzed softly. My tools were exactly where I'd left them. And sitting there in the center of it all, waiting, like it always had, was the Mustang. My grandpa's voice echoed in my head. When life gets messy, focus on what you can fix with your hands. So that's what I did. I grabbed my tools, cranked up the old radio in the corner, and got to work. I don't know how long I was at it. Could have been hours. Could have been all night. At some point, Frank showed up. The sun was creeping in through the windows now, casting long streaks of gold across the floor. He leaned against the doorway, sipping his coffee, watching me in silence. After a moment, he said, "Engine sounds good." I wiped my hands on a rag, nodding. "Yeah, finally got the timing right." Frank nodded. Then, after a beat, "You want to talk about it?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared down at the engine, at the intricate puzzle of parts and bolts, all working together in perfect harmony. Unlike my relationship, she was cheating, I said finally. Frank let out a low whistle. Yeah. I exhaled sharply. With her boss. Probably for months. Frank took another sip of coffee. "You beat the crap out of him?" That actually made me laugh. For the first time in days. "Nah," I muttered. "Not worth it." Frank nodded approvingly. "Smart man." Silence settled between us. Then he said, "You know, your grandpa would be proud of you." My chest tightened. Not because I was sad, but because for the first time in a long time, I actually believed it. For the next few weeks, I kept my head down. If I wasn't working on customer cars, I was under the Mustang, fine-tuning every last detail. The guys started bringing me dinner, worried I wasn't eating right. One afternoon, Frank pulled me aside. "You're here too much," he said gruffly. I frowned. "You literally pay me to be here." Frank sighed. "Kid, I appreciate the work ethic, but you gotta go home sometime. Take a breather. Live your life." I just shrugged. "And do what?" Frank narrowed his eyes. "I don't know. Something that doesn't involve oil stains." I snorted. "Like what? Take up knitting?" "Hell, I don't know." He shrugged. "Go sit in a coffee shop. Read a book. Talk to a woman who doesn't treat you like garbage." I shook my head, grabbing a wrench. "Not really in the mood to date." Frank chuckled. "Who said anything about dating? Just go be a normal damn person for an hour." I sighed. But later that day, I found myself across the street from the garage, stepping into a little coffee shop I'd passed 100 times but never bothered to go into. It smelled like cinnamon and espresso, and for some reason, that made my chest feel lighter. I sat down, not really paying attention, scrolling through my phone, until a voice interrupted my thoughts. "Rough day?" I looked up. A waitress stood there, holding a coffee pot. Big brown eyes. Dark curls pulled into a loose ponytail. A patient, knowing smile. She wasn't pushy. Wasn't overly friendly. Just there. I blinked. Yeah, I guess." She nodded, pouring coffee into the cup in front of me. "Want some company with that, or you need space?" The way she asked, instead of just assuming, threw me off. I hesitated. "Space if that's okay." She smiled again, nodding. "Sure thing. Wave if you need a refill." Then she walked away. Didn't hover. Didn't ask questions. Just let me be. I stared after her for a second, then took a sip of my coffee. And for the first time in a long time, I felt okay. I started going there most days. Not for any reason, really. Just needed somewhere quiet to think that wasn't full of cars and worried coworkers. Her name was Emily. She worked there part-time while finishing nursing school. We talked a little more each time. She asked about my job, not in a fake, polite way, but in a real way, like she actually cared. One day, during a slow shift, she sat across from me, stretching her legs with an exhausted sigh. "Hope you don't mind," she said, rubbing her temples. "Been on my feet all day." I shrugged. "Knock yourself out." She grinned. "You know, I see you in here all the time. but I don't even know your name. Jake. She held out a hand. Emily. I shook it. It felt easy. Not forced. Not complicated. Just easy. Later that week, her car started making a weird noise. Without thinking, I grabbed my tools and followed her out to the parking lot. It was just a loose belt. Took me 5 minutes to fix. She tried to pay me. I waved her off. Don't worry about it. The next day, she brought me a homemade sandwich and chips. Nothing fancy. Just a small, thoughtful thing. And it hit me. She wasn't trying to impress me. Wasn't trying to make me prove my worth. She just appreciated me. The way I was. Grease stains and all. A few more weeks passed. The Mustang was finally finished. Every bolt, every panel, every piece. Exactly how my grandpa would have wanted it. I took Emily for the first drive. She ran her hands over the leather seats, grinning. This is incredible. I swallowed, gripping the wheel. Yeah. She glanced at me. You okay? I nodded slowly. Yeah, I think I am. Then I turned the key. The engine roared to life, the sound vibrating through my bones. And as we pulled onto the road, wind rushing through the open windows, the weight in my chest finally lifted. Because for the first time in months, I knew exactly where I was going. I pulled the Mustang into my parents' driveway, the engine purring like a dream. Emily sat in the passenger seat, fingers trailing over the leather seats, her eyes shining with that same excitement I used to see in my own reflection when I was a kid sitting in my grandpa's garage. She didn't say much, just let me have the moment. Let me breathe it in. The front door swung open before I even stepped out. Mom stood there, hands over her mouth, eyes glistening. My dad, ever the quiet one, just nodded approvingly from the porch, arms crossed. Mom finally snapped out of it and rushed over, her hands hovering over the hood like she was afraid to touch it. Oh, Jake, she whispered. You did it. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. Yeah. Dad ran a hand over the polished exterior, then clapped a hand on my shoulder. The same way Grandpa used to. He'd be proud, he said. Simple. Direct. No fluff. And that was all I needed to hear. Emily stood back, letting my family have their moment, but Mom noticed her immediately. Oh, and who's this? She asked, wiping at her eyes like she hadn't just been crying over a car. Emily smiled, a little shy but warm. Emily. Mom beamed. Well, any friend of Jake's is always welcome. You staying for dinner? Emily glanced at me like she was checking first. I like that about her. I nodded. Yeah, she's staying. And just like that, Emily was part of the family. Dinner was filled with stories, mostly about Grandpa and his Mustang. Emily listened intently, laughing at all the right moments, asking questions like she actually cared. Not once did she make me feel like I should be more than I was. And that meant everything. After dinner, as I was walking Emily to her car, she turned to me, leaning against the door. So, how do you feel? I exhaled, thought about it. Then, for the first time in a long time, I told the truth. Free. Emily smiled. Good. I watched her drive away, something warm settling in my chest. Yeah, I was gonna be okay. Meanwhile, Lindsay was falling apart. I didn't hear from her for weeks. Then one day, Diane called me. She's been blowing up our phones, she sighed, crying about how she made a mistake, and you won't talk to her. I leaned against my truck, rubbing my temple. Diane, I'm not telling you to take her back, honey, she cut in. Just be prepared. She's coming to see you. I closed my eyes. Great. Sure enough, a few hours later, I was at the garage when I heard the familiar sound of Lindsay's car pulling up. I wiped my hands on a rag, not even bothering to turn around. Footsteps. Then a soft, shaky, Jake? I sighed and finally faced her. She looked rough. Makeup smudged like she'd been crying. Her perfect designer clothes swapped for an old hoodie and jeans. It almost made me feel bad for her. Almost. Lindsay. My voice was flat, impersonal. Her lip trembled. Can we talk? I tossed the rag onto the workbench. Talk about what? She took a step closer, wringing her hands. She let out a shaky breath. I screwed up. I raised an eyebrow. Yeah. She sniffled. I was stupid. I thought, she shook her head. I thought I wanted something more. But Ethan, her voice broke. He never cared about me, Jake. I didn't say anything. Because, honestly, that wasn't my problem. She swallowed hard. He got caught cheating with someone else at the office Christmas party. His wife found out and took him for everything. He lost his job, his reputation. And me, she let out a bitter laugh. I lost everything, too. I crossed my arms. And her eyes filled with fresh tears. Anne, I miss you. I stared at her, waiting, because I knew there was more. I thought I was moving up, she whispered. I thought I was evolving. Her face crumpled. But I was just stupid. I threw away something real for a guy who never even saw me as more than a fling. I tilted my head. And now that your upgrade is gone, you think you can come back to me? She flinched like I'd slapped her. No, she insisted, shaking her head. That's not. Save it, Lindsay. My voice was calm, tired, final. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but I felt nothing. Not anger, not heartbreak, just nothing. She wiped at her face. A shaky breath. I wish I could take it back. I gave her a long, hard look. Then I simply said, I don't. And with that, I turned back to my work. She stood there for a moment, probably expecting me to say more. But I didn't. Eventually, I heard her footsteps retreat. Then her car started. And just like that, she was gone. Months passed. I barely thought about Lindsay anymore. She moved back in with her parents for a while, then took a lower-paying job at a smaller firm. She was still digging herself out of the mess she'd made. Meanwhile, I was thriving. Business at the garage was booming. Frank was talking about retiring soon and wanted me to take over as a partner. Emily and I were still taking things slow, but damn if she didn't make me smile like an idiot every time she walked into the garage, holding a coffee in one hand and a bag of sandwiches in the other. One day, she showed up while I was working on the Mustang. She slid into the driver's seat, running her fingers over the steering wheel. Tell me about him, she said softly. I blinked. Who? Your grandpa. I hesitated. Then, for the first time in a long time, I talked about him. Told her about the first time he let me hold a wrench. The way he'd laugh, deep and booming, whenever I got grease on my nose. The way he'd always say, fix what you can, and don't waste time on what you can't. Emily smiled, listening intently. Then she looked up at me and said, he'd be really proud of you. Something in my chest unlocked. Because this time, I actually believed it. Later that night, I took her for a drive. The Mustang rumbled under us, the city lights stretching ahead like a road to something better. She glanced over, smiling. Where are we going? I smirked. Anywhere we want. And with that, I hit the gas, leaving the past in the dust, and never looking back. I pulled the Mustang into my parents' driveway, the engine humming like a heartbeat. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the leather. She didn't say much. She never felt the need to fill the silence with meaningless words. She just let me have this moment. The front door swung open before I even stepped out. Mom stood there, hands over her mouth, eyes already shining with unshed tears. My dad, ever the quiet one, just nodded from the porch, arms crossed over his chest. Mom finally snapped out of it and rushed over, her hands hovering over the hood like she was afraid to touch it. Oh, Jake, she whispered. You did it. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. Yeah. Dad ran a hand along the polished exterior, then clapped me on the shoulder. The same way Grandpa used to. He'd be proud, he said. Simple. Direct. No fluff. And that was all I needed to hear. Emily stood back, giving me space, but Mom noticed her immediately. Oh, and who's this? She asked, wiping at her eyes like she hadn't just been crying over a car. Emily smiled, tucking a loose curl behind her ear. Emily. Mom beamed. Well, any friend of Jake's is always welcome. You staying for dinner? Emily glanced at me first, checking if I was okay with it. I like that about her. I nodded. Yeah, she's staying. And just like that, Emily was part of the family. Dinner was easy, comfortable in a way I hadn't felt in months. Mom asked a million questions, Dad listened with his quiet approval, and Emily answered everything with genuine warmth. Not once did she make me feel like I should be more than I was. And that meant everything. After dinner, I walked Emily to her car. She leaned against the door, hands in her jacket pockets. "So," she said, tilting her head, "how do you feel?" I exhaled, thinking about it. Then, for the first time in a long time, I told the truth. Free. Emily's smile was small but knowing. Good. I watched her drive away, something warm settling in my chest. Yeah, I was gonna be okay. Meanwhile, Lindsay was falling apart. I hadn't heard from her in weeks. Then, out of nowhere, Diane called me. "She's been blowing up our phones," she said, sighing, "crying about how she made a mistake, and you won't talk to her." I leaned against my truck, rubbing my temple. "Diane, I'm not telling you to take her back, honey," she cut in. "Just be prepared. She's coming to see you." I closed my eyes. Of course she is. A few hours later, I was at the garage when I heard the familiar sound of Lindsay's car pulling up. I wiped my hands on a rag, not even bothering to turn around. Footsteps, then a soft, shaky, "Jake?" I sighed and finally faced her. She looked rough. Her makeup was smudged, like she'd been crying. She wasn't wearing her usual designer clothes, just an old hoodie and jeans. It almost made me feel bad for her. Almost. "Lindsay." My voice was flat, impersonal. Her lip trembled. "Can we talk?" I tossed the rag onto the workbench. "Talk about what?" She took a step closer, wringing her hands. She let out a shaky breath. "I screwed up." I raised an eyebrow. "Yeah." She sniffled. "I was stupid. I thought," she shook her head, "I thought I wanted something more. But Ethan," her voice broke, "he never cared about me, Jake." I didn't say anything, because, honestly, that wasn't my problem. She swallowed hard. "He got caught cheating with someone else at the office Christmas party. His wife found out and took him for everything. He lost his job, his reputation. And me," she let out a bitter laugh. "I lost everything, too." I crossed my arms. "And?" Her eyes filled with fresh tears. "And I miss you." I stared at her, waiting, because I knew there was more. "I thought I was moving up," she whispered. "I thought I was evolving." Her face crumpled. "But I was just stupid. I threw away something real for a guy who never even saw me as more than a fling." I tilted my head. "And now that your upgrade is gone, you think you can come back to me?" She flinched like I'd slapped her. "No," she insisted, shaking her head. "That's not." "Save it, Lindsay." My voice was calm, tired, final. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but I felt nothing. Not anger, not heartbreak, just nothing. She wiped at her face. A shaky breath. "I wish I could take it back." I gave her a long, hard look. Then I simply said, "I don't." And with that, I turned back to my work. She stood there for a moment, probably expecting me to say more. But I didn't. Eventually, I heard her footsteps retreat. Then her car started. And just like that, she was gone. Months passed. I barely thought about Lindsay anymore. She moved back in with her parents for a while, then took a lower-paying job at a smaller firm. She was still digging herself out of the mess she'd made. Meanwhile, I was thriving. Business at the garage was booming. Frank was talking about retiring soon and wanted me to take over as a partner. Emily and I were still taking things slow, but damn if she didn't make me smile like an idiot every time she walked into the garage, holding a coffee in one hand and a bag of sandwiches in the other. One day, she showed up while I was working on the Mustang. She slid into the driver's seat, running her fingers over the steering wheel. "Tell me about him," she said softly. I blinked. "Who?" "Your grandpa." I hesitated. Then, for the first time in a long time, I talked about him. Told her about the first time he let me hold a wrench. The way he'd laugh, deep and booming, whenever I got grease on my nose. The way he'd always say, "Fix what you can, and don't waste time on what you can't." Emily smiled, listening intently. Then she looked up at me and said, "He'd be really proud of you." Something in my chest unlocked. Because this time, I actually believed it. Later that night, I took her for a drive. The Mustang rumbled under us, the city lights stretching ahead like a road to something better. She glanced over, smiling. "Where are we going?" I smirked. "Anywhere we want." And with that, I hit the gas, leaving the past in the dust, and never looking back.